And the last thing to say is the 4 agreements for courageous conversations to help us get as much out of it as possible. One is stay engaged. I know that's hard on a Zoom meeting. You're tempted to check email and other stuff like that, but try to stay engaged. The second one is expect to be uncomfortable. We hope that some of these questions and comments will make us uncomfortable, which will help us continue to think about our real feelings and thoughts. Speak your truth means don't be quiet if you have something to say. It also means don't tell somebody else's truth, tell your own truth. And the last one is expect and accept non-closure. We're not going to solve it, whatever it is. We're not going to solve it in half an hour, and so, or an hour and a half, or 2 hours. So just expect that we're on our way on the journey. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy.
Thank you, Neil. So the recording has begun, just to give everyone a heads up. As Neil stated, this month, our topic is the color of the recession, women out of the workforce. And we will begin with the first video clip, and then I will open it up for discussion. Beth, if you could do me a huge favor and manage anyone who's waiting to enter the meeting once I start sharing my screen, that would be very helpful.
Emma is a Latina hairdresser. Stay-at-home orders went into effect and large parts of the economy shut down. She is among the tens of millions of workers who have lost their jobs in just a couple of months. A closer look at data show how that economic pain is distributed among Americans. And it turns out that job losses during the pandemic have fallen disproportionately on people like Emma. Here's how gender, occupation, and race data can help us understand record unemployment numbers. It's actually unique to this unemployment crisis that women have been the hardest hit.
In previous recessions, women tended to fare better than men.
Men held the dominant share of jobs in sectors like manufacturing and construction, which typically bear the brunt of an economic downturn. During the 2009 financial crisis, unemployment among men reached 11.1%, compared to a peak of 9% for women. This period also marked the first time in U.S. history that women outnumbered men in the workforce, since many of them had occupations and sectors that were more resilient during a recession, like education or healthcare. Economists say many married women who hadn't been employed also joined the workforce to replace or supplement their partner's lost income. By 2019, women outnumbered men in the U.S. paid workforce for the second time in history.
Growth in service sector professions actually allowed women to overtake men as the dominant share of all non-farm payrolls that occurred, at the end of last year.
But the pandemic has now upended that.
Women account for about 77% of workers in occupations that require close personal contact and can't easily be done remotely, which is, a lot of those jobs have been hit by the social distancing measures. And so those are jobs in food preparation, healthcare support, and personal service, for instance. The unemployment rates for both Black and Hispanic women were higher than the unemployment rate for white women.
If you dive a bit deeper into the data, you see that the service sector jobs that can't be done from home employ more Black and Latinas. For many, working from home is not an option.
People are having to make very difficult choices between what's best for their economic well-being and what's best for their health and public safety.
Valerie Wilson is an economist and director of the Race and Ethnicity program at the Economic Policy Institute. She stresses that economic insecurity isn't the only hurdle Hispanic and Black women face.
workers of color are in a very difficult predicament based on their position in the labor market and in this economy and society as a whole.
Data show that women tend to spend more time than men with household responsibilities and childcare, making job searches much harder. On top of that, most Black and Latinas who work in low-paid jobs are also the sole or primary breadwinners in their households, according to a women's rights group. Wilson and other economists expect the road to recovery to be even steeper for Black women and Latinas.
I think getting back to work will be harder for women and women of color in particular, because when we recover, the same jobs that were lost probably will not return as quickly. That will be one factor in a slower recovery in those communities.
All right, so there is a lot to discuss within that clip. There are quite a few of us here, so I'm going to open the chat. If you have a comment that you would like to send to me privately, I can share that with the group without attaching your name to it. If you have a question that you just want to ask the group so we're not talking over each other, you could just drop a question mark in the chat, then I will know what order to call on people in. So a lot covered in that clip with how this unequal recession is impacting Black and Latino women. What are some of your initial thoughts?
So, Amy, wouldn't that be comparable to the information that we received about Black and Latino families, families of color dealing with COVID, and how they have been disproportionately marginalized as a result of COVID? So Black and Latino women kind of fall into that same category. Yes, no, maybe so?
I think they're two separate issues that are closely linked. So not necessarily being impacted in the fact that you have COVID-19 or you're more at risk of COVID-19, but if your employment is tied to close contact or in-person work, like they mentioned in the video, food preparation, healthcare, or personal services, which 77% by their account are held by Black and Latino women, then in that way, the shutdown orders, the lowering of hours where businesses are available, then absolutely you're impacted at a disproportionate rate.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. One thing that I found interesting in the video is that as it discussed how Black and Latino women were disproportionately impacted by job loss, the nuances surrounding that, because women in general have a harder load of the childcare and household responsibilities in many cases, that it makes re-entering the workforce even more difficult. If you are the primary childcare support, if you are responsible for maintaining the household, etc., then searching for a job has an added layer of difficulty. How is this showing up in our community?
I think there's another characteristic besides childcare and household stuff. It's education. I'm willing to bet that it's the women who are mostly keeping the kids' nose to the grindstone in terms of the schooling. And so that's an additional issue in terms of re-entering the job force.
Absolutely. And so many women are also caring for children while also caring for their parents as well. So that, if we didn't need another layer, there is. So how is this disproportionate impact? How do we see this showing up in our community?
Hey, this is Megan. I would say in our community, I get really frustrated to see that, there are a lot of businesses that aren't willing or seemingly willing to participate with the city, school district, and other agencies to help supplement like cost of childcare and things like that, and things that really would, I think like the local impact here could be huge if we could mobilize local employers, the city, the school district, and all of our nonprofit agencies with like a singular focus. But there's like a resistance and a lack. There's not only a lack of focus, there's a resistance from the business community that I've seen to actually work with people. And my example and evidence for that is a couple of years ago when there was the NERSA grant, the 5-year renewal, there were 3 hearings held by the Equal Opportunities Commission down at the city. And all we heard from the business community was, why aren't the schools doing more? Why aren't these other places doing more? And there was like, and if kids could just keep their pants pulled up, we could hire more of them. There was not any real accountability. So I'm very frustrated with that part of our community for not maybe stepping it up a little more to help with some of these issues.
Thank you, Megan.
This is Penny. And when I think about women becoming overwhelmed, women who are caring for themselves, their children, their extended family members, and something's got to give. I see them entering our systems of care through a variety of ways, whether that's through, trying to manage things and turning to substance use for coping or some alleviation of whatever they're experiencing. I see that coming through our child welfare door when maybe they're not able to make ends meet or they're becoming overstressed. And I see that coming through our mental health door too, where they just don't have the capacity to continue without added supports and resources. I think the longer this pandemic goes on, all of those areas, they're increasing.
Absolutely, very good point. Towards the end of that clip, it said a lot of the women who have been impacted by the types of jobs that have been lost, that those jobs are not coming back quickly. So there may be an even longer delay once we get our footing back on this recovery, that some of those jobs may never come back. So what are other ways that we are seeing this in our communities specifically?
Okay, I'm just going to jump in one more time. I think it would be so amazing if there were some kind of a task force. I know there's some stuff at the county level, but even at even a city level, sorry, it's dinner time. We could have a task force of concerned citizens that actually had some power to drive some like unified goal making and decision making forward, because that's where I see that there's a lack of movement, because like there's not a critical mass of people who are empowered to make this change that care enough or are represented by women and families of color.
Excellent point. So I received a question in the chat. I may need a little clarification with this. It says, I have a question if we're seeing any uptick in evidence of where we'd look to see if this is happening. I'm going to make an assumption that your question is reference to where we are seeing Black and Latino women in our community most disproportionately impacted by the recession, which is starting to be coined the she session because of the types of jobs that are impacted. I would say just off the top of my head, childcare, women that are deemed essential workers that are working in, let's say, fast food, healthcare services, that may not be seeing as many people because they want to keep numbers down, personal care services, so salons, estheticians, etc. So those are some of the examples. that's hitting close to home with us, with the school district, our paras. How comfortable are our paras with working if they are being asked to do face-to-face, working with certain segments of our students, even during distance and virtual learning. So those are some examples of how this may be directly impacting our community. And Megan, thank you again. I think you've brought up some critical supports that a lot of us would love to see in place, so that we can better weather this she-cession, which is disproportionately impacting Black and Latino women. I'm going to call an audible because my team was not aware of this next clip, so hopefully they approve. I found it kind of late, and it's an interesting twist. So far we've talked about women who have left the workforce because they have been forced out. Some studies show that as many as 2 million women have chosen to leave the workforce. So I am going to share this clip, and then we'll have some discussion, same issue, but a different perspective.
Thriving communities begin.
I thought we were going to be able to avoid the ad.
With loving.
Probably half of those women are either Black or Hispanic. Experts say the pandemic is simply exacerbating the role of women in the family, and more than 2 million other women are considering leaving the workforce soon. More than 6 months into the pandemic, and the Department of Labor is monitoring a shift in the workforce. Last month alone, 865,000 women nationwide left the workforce. About a third are Latina, and 58,000 are Black.
What this particular situation does is exacerbates ongoing structural inequalities. It exacerbates the inequities produced by discrimination in employment and discrimination in housing. And so it really makes a bad situation worse.
Locally, Sandang says our most diverse communities are hardest hit by job loss, and women make up a majority of the workforce for industries with the most layoffs.
What we're seeing when you kind of add those up is there's this double effect where women, especially women of color, are overly represented in people who lost their jobs.
Not all women were forced out of their jobs. Management consulting firm McKinsey & Company estimates 2 million women are considering leaving. Jess Wang authored the study and found Black women are particularly vulnerable.
They're 2.5 times more likely to have experienced death of a loved one during the COVID-19 crisis.
It's one reason the Chicano Federation says more is needed to support families vulnerable to the physical and economic effects of the virus.
It has been a multitude of different factors, but I do think that we need to look at that in this recovery, because we can't afford to have, that percentage of Black and brown women left out of the workforce and falling further behind their colleagues in terms of advancing in their careers.
It, of course, remains to be seen whether women will return to the workforce after the pandemic is over. However, the McKinsey study found that it could lead to more long-term issues in finding qualified women for leadership roles.
So that adds a new twist to our conversation. So far we've discussed women who have been forcibly displaced from the workforce. But what happens, it's said that Black women were 2.5 more times likely to have a loved one die of COVID-19. And how does that impact your mental health? How does that impact, the way your world existed pre-COVID-19? And what role does mental health play in us getting through this pandemic together, coupled with the recession that is disproportionately impacting women? And then we could also talk about the stigma surrounding seeking help for mental health concerns. So a lot to talk about. Feel free to jump in.
Kay and I just went for a walk in the mall. I'm not sure if that was putting ourselves too much at risk, but we both wore masks. Anyway, as we were walking, Kay said, almost every store in the mall says, we're hiring. So that would be another wrinkle to talk about in this.
Mostly part-time.
I'm sure that it's part-time, and I'm sure that it's not very high wages. But apparently there are some places that are still looking for people to work for them.
Thank you.
Amy, can you expel on that? Currently, 865,000 women have left the workforce, and 2 million are thinking of leaving the workforce due to what?
So the 865,000 number are women who have been displaced from the workforce. So they have lost their job through some form or fashion related to COVID-19, whether that's closures, a lessening of hours, etc. The 2 million in the last clip that said that approximately 2 million women were contemplating leaving the workforce. And it may be some of the things that we've already discussed. With schools not being open, you have the online learning responsibility added to women. You may be caring for your children and also a parent. You may be struggling to deal with the loss of a loved one because of COVID-19. So I'm sure that there are several reasons and layered reasons for why women are contemplating leaving the workplace. So the second figure, the almost 2 million are thinking about it, that's outside of women who have been displaced. And then another important point that I thought they brought up is that women falling behind their colleagues in terms of career advancement. And what are the long-term implications of being able to fill these roles, these leadership positions with women? So often our careers are interrupted because of maybe moves, because your spouse or your partner gets a job, or you leave the workforce for a certain period of time to birth and to raise children. And now this may be an additional exodus of women leaving the workplace. And what are the long-term impacts of that, of women in leadership? In corporation, in government positions, et cetera. And what does that look like 10 years from now? So there is a question that came in. These jobs that are available are almost all putting oneself at risk. And if you are Black, Indigenous, or Latinx, is that a risk you are willing to take? What are the citizens of Beloit planning to do to support their neighbors during this time? What can you, all caps, do to have a small impact on your community? So, excellent question. And I think this is a perfect place to have those conversations. So people are very uncomfortable in most cases with putting themselves at risk, especially if you know in the back of your mind that if I catch COVID-19, I may have a disproportionate response and possibly a worse outcome because I am a Black woman. So what are we willing to do as a community to support each other, to lessen the impact of our community? Excellent question.
Is there any movement in Beloit to collectively come together to raise funds for childcare and food and so on and so on?
The only one that I can think of off the top of my head is the Immigrant Outreach Fund. I know that they have been a great resource for gas cards, for helping with rent assistance, and to help with basic needs for people that are struggling due to the pandemic. So there, right. Yes.
So if people don't know about that, in Janesville, the Faith Lutheran Church collects money for the gas cards and the grocery cards, and those cards are distributed through the YWCA's immigrant outreach, Gina Uzunzu. And then the YWCA has a special fund for helping immigrants that do not qualify for any benefits at all. And so does ECHO. ECHO has a special housing fund. So if, you know, those are 3 places that people could make donations to help that population. That doesn't address the issue of the African Americans in the community, and because, you know, we all know that the funds are not sufficient for the number of people that are unemployed. I also make a comment that I think that there are always barriers to women working, and it's just become worse now with the children at home, because childcare is a huge barrier for women getting good jobs, keeping good jobs. And until we address that issue in our society, and right now that's hard because of COVID, but I mean, we need to be thinking of it. This isn't gonna last forever, at least I don't think it is. And so, you know, we need to be ready to address that issue when we can with schools, but also with good childcare for young children. Will make a huge difference. And also maybe education. Maybe Black Hawk Tech should be looking at ways to offer some programs to help the women whose jobs have been lost permanently, retrain for some jobs in healthcare, perhaps, because I think we're going to need that. Just some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And if people are aware of resources, feel free to drop those in the chat. I would recommend, if that chat starts to fill up, those 3 white dots at the bottom right-hand corner, if you click on that, that first option should be to save the chat. So make sure you go ahead and grab the chat before you leave, but wait until the end so you catch everything that ends up there. So what do we think about the second clip with the impact of mental health? And my condolences if anyone in this meeting has experienced a personal loss due to COVID-19. It's horrible to think about, but imagine that happening and you still do have your job. Like, what does employment look like once you've suffered such a huge loss?
Well, and the loss itself is magnified by the fact that family is not really allowed to visit with somebody who has COVID in the hospital. And so you have a huge amount of what do I want to say, of guilt that you weren't there for that person, whether you could be or not, and anger that you were not allowed to be there. So that's a whole nother mental health issue that is going on with COVID.
Absolutely. And not even being able to grieve in the ways that we're used to with family and lots of food and coming together and retelling of stories and memories. That is no longer an option right now, or is severely restricted. And what role does that play on a person's mental health, not being able to process in a way that they thought they would be?
I wanted to share a little bit of something too. This is Holly. I wanted to thank Nancy for bringing up the housing issue, and that there are some funds for people, maybe never enough, but the issue of evictions, I think, is kind of underneath here too, because if you, certainly the mental health issues are huge, the loss on so many levels, but what if you literally are not able to, keep your home? And we know that those evictions are, there's ebb and flow back and forth in terms of the policy, I guess, that they're trying to get through Congress. But I don't know anyone personally, but I know I was teaching this afternoon and my students were talking about eviction. What was that book by Mark Desmond? Evicted. And that was Milwaukee. And this was, of course, before COVID-19. So I think these already people who are sort of on the edge, it is likely to be exacerbated now, of course. So this is a great conversation. Thank you, everybody.
This is Kendra Schiffman. Hopefully you can hear. One of the things also related to mental health, it's not just the experience of loss, which is incredibly difficult, but also the mental health toll of when you are primary breadwinner, primary caregiver, and the overwhelming amount of responsibilities without having the childcare supports because of the health risks also contributes to mental health needs. But then because of all those overwhelming responsibilities, it makes it very difficult to access the support even when it's virtual. And something that has not come up is there are children with behavioral health needs who may have not been attached or linked to services prior to COVID, but maybe those needs are developing, or the context of virtual school may exacerbate those needs and they don't have the same kind of access to those services, also increases a level of stress. And again, it's often assumed, and even in this conversation, yes, the large majority of people taking care of children are women, and that's often not questioned as to why the large majority of people taking care of and expected to take care of children are women. So it often automatically falls, and then the amount of support services that may have been available before are not, in addition to an increase of responsibilities. So that too takes a mental health toll on women.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Thank you to everyone who has let me know in the chat that you could only message myself or Beth. I have corrected that, so you should be able to post publicly and privately between each other. So thank you for that. There was a question that came in, if anyone is able to answer this. It says, are there any statewide initiatives that we can petition for that support better workplace daycare systems? So if anyone is aware of that, please either unmute yourself and share with the group, or drop that into the chat and share with everyone. Thank you, Beth, for putting the information on United Way. Very helpful. So do we have any concerns about the long-term impacts of both women being displaced from the workforce and for women choosing, at least for a time, to step away from the workforce? What negative impacts do we foresee happening? And what things can we do now to potentially mitigate that, to support women that we may know that have been displaced or chosen to leave the workforce? What are some ideas that we have?
Well, I've always thought it was a bit unfair that when women stay home and take care of children or other family members and really contribute to the well-being of the whole community, that they are not, and they do it, they don't expect compensation, but at the same time, they are not part of the Social Security system. So a long-term effect is how this affects their Social Security benefits when they get ready to retire. So that would be maybe one small thing that could be done, is to recognize the contribution that they're making to the economy by caring for people, and then somehow government puts the money into their Social Security account, so when they get to retirement age, they have a greater benefit.
Excellent point, Nancy, and you hold on to that. In the final clip that we will watch, it's just over 7 minutes long, and it talks about some of those long-term impacts and the people who represent us, what might be some barriers that are where they are not hearing what is truly happening at the ground level. So please hold on to that and feel free to bring that up again once we watch that third clip, because I think that's a really important point. So there's a question from Katie to everyone. How does our segregated society exacerbate this inequity in helping others in our community? How can we remove this barrier? I feel like segregated income communities, it's easy to not recognize how much suffering is going on. Yeah, absolutely. If it's not happening within our personal circle, we really do have to work to see what is going on in our larger community. And because of the constraints of COVID-19, that becomes more challenging. Us getting out and mixing and mingling is just not happening like it was before. So if it's not someone that we're automatically connected to on social media, or it's not a friend or family member that we would pick up the phone and call and check on, the opportunity for us to miss what is going on in our community is increased dramatically. Great point. Oh, so someone just sent me a message. In the German social security system, women get credit for the years that they raise children. Well, I completely support that. Excellent. Are there any other thoughts on the two clips that we've seen so far before we move on to our final clip?
Amy, this is not Santa, this is Jean. I appreciate so much the comments that have been coming through. I feel like the group here is a listening group, that we're almost overwhelmed by the struggle that we see and we may hear in the newspaper. I think the fact that a lot of us do not have firsthand experience or with our friends, that makes it so much more difficult to know what to do. I appreciated Megan's suggestion as far as, you know, what is the community doing? Are we Forward Janesville or groups like this? Is there a committee that is formed that can look specifically at this situation and be really make a difference here and help all of us become more aware, and we could do something as a community. I also applaud the Immigrant Outreach Fund, because that was started by a few people, and they didn't wait for the government to step in or the city to do something. But I really admire the group that said, we see the problem, we're going to do something. I guess I personally feel like this is a situation again that we're trying, as mostly a white group here tonight, we're trying to decide what we should do for our friends of color. And until we can sit down or Zoom with them, we're not going to really know the depth of their needs and where they would appreciate the most help.
Thank you, Jean. That is a perspective that I appreciate you for giving voice to. And I think this might be the first step is the awareness piece. You know, when you get a new car, you see them all over. So sometimes the first step is to put the issue on your radar, but I think important next steps may include Reaching out to your school board, your city council, your county board, our local officials. We have an election coming up. If those positions change, make sure that we're reaching out and we're saying, hey, we recognize this as a need in our community. What are your plans? And if you don't have plans, then the expectation is that you work with community members to develop plans that are going to be positively impactful to our local communities. So it requires us to put in the work. It requires us to be involved, and it requires consistency. Great point. Okay. So, oh, go ahead. Someone.
Amy, if I could, before you go to the next clip,
Please.
I struggle a little bit with the COVID as an excuse narrative, because the issues that you're addressing in large part existed long before COVID. So nothing that you're bringing up tonight is new. COVID may be exacerbating some of the issues, but the opportunity to address things and the opportunity to engage, it has existed for quite some time, and people still haven't. I'm not so sure that post-COVID, people are going to engage anyway. So I need to make that point, because as we're talking about segregation and the issue being exacerbated by COVID, the segregation also existed prior to COVID, and people weren't, and even though it was being talked about on some level, people really weren't moving to do anything about it. So I just had to bring that up because I really struggle with the COVID as an excuse narrative.
No, I appreciate that. And a lot of people, well, some people will say, you know, if I was around during, you know, the period of enslavement or the civil rights movement, or I would be doing this, I would be doing that. And that's really easy to say, but the way you truly answer that question is there's a lot of unrest and disproportionate pain going on now. And what are you doing? Because that is exactly what you would have been doing then. The same thing that you are doing now. And absolutely, COVID exacerbates, but COVID did not create. I am hopeful, cautiously optimistic that I think COVID has slowed a lot of us down and made us stop and take stock of what is going on internally and within our community. And I'm hopeful that people will, moving forward, make different decisions to engage, to seek improvement for themselves, for people that don't look like them, etc. So I am cautiously optimistic. But Mark, I thank you so much for bringing up that point. I do see another message in the chat. Does anyone know if there are any local organizations that support women of color running for office at a local and state level? Okay. So if anyone is aware of that, please unmute yourself and jump in or drop any information pertaining to women of color running for state office, state or local office, into the chat. While we do that, I am going to queue up our final clip, which is about 7 minutes long.
Us over here at Rising, but the facts are no less devastating. According to a new piece in the Washington Post, our current economic conditions impact some poorer groups a lot more than they have others.
Yeah, absolutely. The story says that COVID-19's recession is, quote, the most unequal in our modern history, and that low-income minority workers and mothers of school-age children seem to have been the hardest hit. Joining us to discuss the startling new finding and the state of stimulus talks is Huffington Post senior reporter Zach Carter. Great to see you, Zach.
Good to see you, Zach.
Good to see you guys.
What did you make of this report? I mean, look, I'm sure it's not surprising you. It wasn't surprising to us, but just seeing the charts there and having it quantified, the most unequal recession in modern American history, like, what does that mean?
I have to say, I was actually a little bit surprised by this. It's not a secret, as you note, that the recession has disproportionately affected lower income segments of the population. The jobs that have disappeared and have not come back are generally jobs that didn't pay very well to begin with. And so people who have been hit hardest are people who work those jobs. That is not a huge surprise, but what really did surprise me was how it differed from previous recessions. You know, I studied the financial crisis very closely and the Great Recession very closely as a reporter, and that was not an egalitarian recession. That was worse for people at the bottom and the top. All recessions are, but this one is so much worse than that one was. It is really astonishing when you look at the data. The jobs for low-income people just are not coming back right now. And I think we are looking at a very, very long-term, and this happens after every recession where you have unequal pain and the recovery for people at the bottom takes longer. And you have essentially a compression on wages that happens that lasts for years after the recession. But this one is going to be so much worse. Even once we get back to full employment, whenever that is, the type of jobs that are going to be available are going to be much worse than they were when we went into this.
The one that really gets to me, Zach, is this one, that 20% of all Americans aged 20 to 24 lost employment in the early months, and that those 25 to 34 have recovered only 43% of lost employment. What does that do to a generation over the next decade?
It's hard to predict for that, these particular young people, but my own generation, I mean, I just slipped in before the financial crisis. I started working in 2006 after college, and people who came in a year or two after me didn't start working until 2010. I mean, it took years for people to find entry-level employment because no one was hiring for entry-level jobs anymore. In part, it's because companies find ways to operate without entry-level workers, and in part, it's because the jobs, companies don't exist. I mean, in this particular recession, with all of these small businesses that are going to be shuttered as a result, there just isn't going to be work for young people. And that is devastating. I mean, you can look at the politics of people in the millennial generation and younger. They're already much more radical than the politics of Gen X or the baby boom generation. I think a lot of that is because they grew up in the Great Recession and had their ideas about how the world works and what constitutes a fair society shaped by a deeply unfair society that was living in what was essentially a depression. That's going to happen again. I see the younger generation getting more radical as a result.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And at the same time, I think part of why it's been so baffling seeing lawmakers sort of not really clued in to how bad the pain is in certain sectors of the society is because it is truly so bifurcated. I think that's also part of why, I mean, look, they floated trillions into the stock market. It's also part of why stock market keeps going up and up and up, because the people who own all the wealth in this country are doing just fine. They're doing better than ever. So the fact that you have such an unequal recession almost renders it invisible to people in this town who just, they're not in the donor class, they're not hearing it from their friends, they're not seeing it in their neighborhoods, they're sort of insulated from the reality of that pain from so many millions of Americans.
I think that's right. And I think, often we talk about policymaking as though every decision that a lawmaker makes is driven by very clear-cut ideological convictions. And there are certainly cases where that is true. I think particularly over the relief negotiations, there are lawmakers who just don't really believe in providing economic relief. But also, there are people who just don't really feel the drive to do something because they're not living in that world. People who do believe in making relief payments, who might, be more feel a fire under them to actually do something, don't feel that fire because the people around them aren't saying it to them every day. They're not watching their friends and relatives lose jobs and have their their future prospects devastated through no fault of their own. And it just doesn't feel quite as important as say, the election, which there are a lot of important things going on in the world, but the worst economic crisis in living memory is certainly one of them.
So, Zach, how do we get out of it? I mean, you literally wrote the book on Keynes. Tell us about if you wanted to actually solve this, what would you do?
You can't get out of this by hoping for better consumer purchasing, right? I mean, one of the problems with the COVID recession is that we actually don't want a lot of businesses to be open in certain places, certain times, because it's not healthy. So you need to find other forms of investment in order to make jobs available and the right kinds of jobs available, and that requires some sort of direction. That requires the state to get involved. So not just funding for state and local governments to prevent people from getting laid off who are be fixing our roads or teaching our kids, but some sort of actual program of public investment from the federal government to make sure that the stuff that needs to be done around the country can be done in a safe way. So we know that we have a massive infrastructure deficit in this country. That's not a secret. It would be really easy to spend a few $1 trillion on infrastructure and keep this thing from getting even worse. And a lot of the construction jobs and things like that, I mean, these are jobs that often typically are directed at more lower education and are lower paying jobs. You can just make those higher paying jobs if you have the government making them.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Zach, tell people about the book.
I wrote about.
All right, so there was a lot in that clip. Just some things I want to recap before we open our discussion. 1 second. So just reiterating the point that this is the most unequal recession in recent memory, definitely. And what does that mean for our community? We've already discussed some of that, but what does that mean for the next generation that is looking to join the workforce over the next decade? And what does it mean if there are few to little entry-level jobs once we get back to full employment? Lots we can get into. How does that impact higher education decisions? If people are looking to go to college, to go to trade school, those decisions may be impacted by the fact that if I'm going to take on student debt, will I have a job when I get done to help pay that debt off? How does that impact voter participation and civic engagement? What about home ownerships and saving and creating generational wealth? And what about healthcare? Since so often our healthcare is tied to our employment, what does that look like for people who are unemployed or underemployed? So that's a lot. What are some thoughts that you are having?
I like Katie's idea. That would be dealing with the infrastructure that he talked about. And it seemed to work in the 30s.
Is there a way to not have it just be infrastructure, but something that all communities need, you know, that is more comprehensive from a job standpoint? Healthcare.
I was also thinking about the green, you know, not just infrastructure again, but alternative energies. And there's a lot of jobs, right, that can be created in that sphere. So maybe these things, you know, I always see things as intersecting, whether we're looking at intersections related to, you know, women of color and class issues, or whether we're looking at solutions. I think there's so many possibilities for a new innovation, but we're, as a human species, we tend to be really stuck in the ways we're doing things. So I always try to find there's like, okay, massive crisis, but what are the opportunities that might be presenting themselves? So I hope that's where we go.
So there is a question in the chat asking if someone could define CCC.
Civilian Conservation Corps.
Yeah,
It was started by FDR. It was actually mostly segregated and only didn't benefit all communities, and obviously only men. So definitely a 21st century version of that would be needed.
Absolutely, and it seems like Mark put a comment in about universal basic income. That would be wonderful. I think there are charged opinions on both sides. And I think we would have to deal with who is eligible for universal basic income. Is it truly universal? And what loopholes will be put in place to keep certain segments of the population out? And how do we combat that? Yeah, definitely a good point. One thing that I would like to dig into with the disclaimer that the YWCA Rock County and Diversity Action Team are nonpartisan, and our partners Community Action are actually apolitical. So I want to be clear on that. But what impact does this have on voter participation and civic engagement. If people feel like they are not being heard from and their representation is not responsive to them, we do risk people giving up and saying, you know what, it doesn't matter. How might this change your views that you hold when your lived experience is not being acknowledged and addressed by your representation? What are some issues that we can foresee that occurring?
Nancy, you're muted.
Muted myself. Sorry, I thought I unmuted myself. I'm encouraged by some of the street protests we're seeing, which are intergenerational, multicultural, and I'm hoping that those people that are there are going to vote. And there seems to be more interest in being civically engaged in this election than I have seen in my lifetime. And I've been watching this for over 50 years. And that's where I'm kind of putting my hope. But there's still a lot of barriers. And one of them is the way redistricting is done. And I think that we need to look at that so that the people choose the representatives, not the representatives choosing their voters. And that way we get more responsive legislation to the issues. And we need to have a robust discussion in this country about not just about individual rights, but about social rights, a right to an education, a right to health care, a right to a livable wage. And we haven't had that. And as a country, just small groups have. And I think that's part of the solution is we've got to keep this civic engagement going and involve those young people and the ones that have been marginalized, because if we don't, the unrest is not going to get any less.
Nancy, thank you so much for that. And I think it's really appropriate as a part of this courageous conversation, as we're focusing on Black and Latino women who have been displaced or left the workforce and the impact that those are having because of what Holly brought up, that intersectionality. You know, things don't happen in silos. We don't exist in silos. Our experiences are not segmented. What can we commit to individually to make sure that the concerns that we are deciding are important are lifted, the word is being spread. And so that if our representation are not personally having those experiences, what can we commit to doing to lift those voices and to make sure that these stories, these experiences cannot be brushed aside and ignored?
Well, most of our state and certainly all of our local representatives are more than willing to have visits from constituents. And if we go and visit, we could take with us somebody who is marginalized, assuming that we know somebody who's marginalized. So anyway, that's one way.
Excellent point. What are some other suggestions, recommendations, things that you are possibly currently doing that you want to see amplified, you want to see traction for certain movements?
Have there been church partnerships between more predominantly Black churches and white churches in the area?
Back in the day, I haven't seen much lately, but there have been. The pattern is there if we just want to revive it.
So where were you going with that idea?
I'm just trying to think of ways to break down barriers between our very segregated communities. I don't know if there's a great solution, you know, it's frustrating.
Can you all hear me?
We can, go ahead.
Okay, because I'm a little bit away from my laptop. I got a whole table in between me and my laptop because I'm painting rocks right now. One of the things that we decided to do in the city of Milton is we're a sponsor for the YWCA Racial Justice Conference, but we've also reached out to other community organizations and encouraged them to participate in that conference and have amplified that. So our Milton Area Chamber of Commerce, our school district, and some of our churches, we have reached out to them and said, hey, this is a great conference, get a hold of us. You know, let's see if we can get more of our community involved in this particular conference. And then after the conference, working with the county, we're going to try and put together a follow-up Zoom call to kind of process the conference with local community leaders throughout Rock County. So hopefully that would take place too. So I think as elected officials, it is our obligation to try to bring our communities together and to promote partnerships, collaborations in any way that we can.
That's excellent to hear. Thank you for the plug for the YWCA's Racial Justice Conference. There will be one more later. So we are always appreciative of that. But I'm very excited to hear that you are going to have a post-conference kind of chat and hopefully moving towards action steps and what individuals and organizations can do to kind of keep that message going and finding ways that we can consistently be active. And it doesn't always have to be a series of huge things. It can be small and steady. So you pick those one or two things that you know you can consistently commit to, and then spread the word about what you're doing. I know oftentimes we want to be modest, and that's not why we're doing things, but sometimes someone hearing the good work that you're doing could inspire them to join in as well.
Amy?
Whoops.
Who else? Go
No,
ahead.
Go ahead.
We're so polite.
Well, I'll go ahead.
And then we'll get to Mark.
Just
Who is
that it's Mark. Hi.
Hi, Mark.
Citizens should know that they can bring to their Rock County supervisors ideas for resolutions. And what I'd like to see also, whenever we get out of the pandemic, is for something to carry with us out of the pandemic, the knowledge of what we've seen of the broken infrastructure, that will be remembered and emphasized at the end. And even if it's non-binding, just something that people can rally behind.
Mark, I have a question about that. Thank you for that reminder about the county level resolutions. So when a citizen brings a request for a resolution, are there action steps that are attached to that? While I think symbolically that's great, I am hesitant to have a resolution that doesn't have any teeth. Are you able to speak at all to that process?
Well, let's see. Anissa might be able to help me out to remember how the process works for a citizen. But I mean, if I just contact my supervisor, I can suggest a resolution. And then you have two kinds of resolution. One is non-binding, the other one would be binding. The binding one would be something like a call for a referendum. And so people would vote, just like we had for the nonpartisan redistricting.
Well,
so
the other
Go ahead.
question I think that Amy is asking is, if a resolution doesn't have action steps connected to it, then we wonder what good it's going to do.
Yes.
Well, do you consider a referendum a non-actionable thing? I consider that a pulse of the county.
Absolutely. That's not what we're talking about.
Oh, okay.
The thing that we wonder about is other kind of resolutions that might be called feel-good resolutions. But you know, there are places where it's important. So for example, the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution is worth something for.
I didn't hear you last.
You muted yourself.
Sorry. The Indigenous Peoples Day is worth something for education for the whole community. And so, but I think Steve Howland might be able to
definitely
comment on that, because I remember a recent resolution that he came up with an amendment for that put some more teeth in it.
Yeah, Steve Howland. You try at times just to get something passed for the symbolic value, just to raise the issue, so that maybe later on you can point to it again and say, do we have any metrics in place that are measuring the disparities that we experience in the community? And can we try to hold ourselves accountable to those metrics? Is it going to do anything? Most of the time, no. Other than hopefully poke the conscience of some people to try to move in that direction. And that I think it does do. I think Josh Smith has been fairly receptive to pushing the county in directions of more and more accountability on that. But once again, you realize the bureaucracy is huge, and to turn something around takes a long time and consistent efforts just over and over and over again.
But if the resolution has metrics built in, then it's way easier to appeal to it in another 6 months or a year or 2 years.
I can speak a little bit about some county resolutions that actually have been incredibly impactful. It wasn't that long ago that the Rock County Board passed a resolution declaring racism a public health issue. They also passed a resolution condemning the murder of George Floyd, and there might have been another resolution. But prior to this meeting, I was on the staff committee meeting speaking on behalf of the county. Has two diversity and inclusion groups. We have one that's a county-wide diversity and inclusion work group, and we have a human services diversity and inclusion work group. One of the things, well, a few of the things that those two resolutions did was they built a foundation for staff and these work groups to promote initiatives and to put money behind those initiatives surrounding diversity and inclusion efforts countywide. So those resolutions were passed, and in the budget, Josh Smith and Kate put in positions for diversity and inclusion. So a coordinator at the Human Services Department and a countywide coordinator. They also put in having the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday off as a paid holiday, and it's an additional paid holiday. It is not in exchange for eliminating another paid holiday. And they also changed the name of the future Rock County Resource Center. So those two resolutions that were passed this year have already had an incredible impact on Rock County overall. And those resolutions were also used to support continuing to budget for diversity and inclusion efforts, trainings, everything that the county has been working towards for all those years. So I know a lot of times resolutions seem to be symbolic, but those resolutions actually have promoted significant change throughout Rock County, and our entire county will benefit from those two resolutions. So I would continue to encourage people to promote and reach out to their county board supervisors and get get items put on for a resolution. And you can have metrics put in those resolutions. Also, creating the Blue Ribbon Commission was a resolution, and that commission has already been created to look at policies and procedures throughout the entire county within a frame of equity and diversity and inclusion.
Thank you so much. Jean, I haven't forgotten about you, but Mayor Welch, since we have you, do you know what work, if any, is being done to publicize the work that's being done or the outcomes of these resolutions so that our community is aware of the work that's attached to it? Because I think that would further promote community engagement in requesting and supporting these resolutions.
So I would imagine when these proposals go in front of the county board to change the personnel policy and to create these positions, I would hope that the Janesville Gazette would highlight these or do an article that magnifies all the work that's being done by these two groups and the county board. But also, I would invite all of you and for you to exchange information with your friends and people in your group outside of this meeting to attend those county board meetings by Zoom. There's county board meetings coming up to pass the budget, and that's a great place for us to have public comment. And I think the county board would appreciate public comment in support of the actions they're taking and will continue to take because of those resolutions and the support that they have. So it's easy for us on the committees, that's what we're doing. We're doing this work and supporting this work. But the county board supervisors, they need outside support too, because not all of these initiatives are going to be embraced by everybody in the community, and for them to have support from community members saying, like, you're doing a great job with this, even though it's slow and it's been a long time coming, and demanding and pressuring them to continue this work. They're much more likely to make those courageous decisions that for some it really is going to be courageous, and it's a new perspective for them to take, and it's an education for them too. So they need our support. So that would be my suggestion. I wish I had the dates in front of me where I could say, hey, jump on these Zoom meetings and try to participate, or even just a phone call. The county board supervisors do not get that much communication at all. So if one county board supervisor gets 2 phone calls, they're like, it blows their mind, right? So if every county board supervisor got 1 or 2 calls, whether they're your county board supervisor or not, they're really going to take that to heart, and they're going to understand where the community is at overall on these issues.
Good point.
Thank you, Inga. Oh, I see that you put these in. I'm going to go ahead and post these. Jean, thank you for being so patient. We all appreciate you. Go ahead. The floor is yours. Thank you, Inga, for making that public.
I would just like to commend Courageous Conversations and Diversity Action Team. I think both of those areas are ways that we can get to know each other so much better and invite our friends of color to be a part of these discussions. Amy, I love that idea, whoever shared that as far as the conference, the YWCA conference, racial justice. Those have been phenomenal. And what I'm wondering is, since you have all the addresses of the people who are attending today, could you possibly send an email that has that YWCA information, or at least post it in the chat room? I think that's a phenomenon.
Right now.
Okay, thank you.
This is
Are you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'd just like to make one more comment. I appreciated also Katie's chat comment about adopting a family, working with not just at Christmas, but being there through the whole time. Thank you, Katie.
So I just wanted to make another point related to, because a lot of things that are coming up are, we're talking about more traditional political institutions, how to influence them, which obviously are key, especially when we're talking, if you don't make investment in redistribution of resources, we can't systemically change some of these things. And so you have to have those priorities, and we have to let elected officials know what we want those priorities to be. But part of some of what has changed Rock County Human Services is collective, a group of people getting together and saying, this is what we want to support, this is what we want. And you get, it's collective action. You get enough people to say and come forward and make recommendations or say, this is what we want. And with that collective support, that can help move things forward. And it doesn't just have to be through traditional political institutions. We are all attached to organizations. We're all attached to workplaces. We're all attached to social groups. And so we have to work through those collective spaces that we are all engaged in to consistently and be willing to put these issues forward over and over and over again, even when they're not, even when people aren't paying attention as much, and even when it's not trending, and to be willing to consistently put ourselves out there to put that on the table wherever we are. And I think we can do that in ways that are, strategic and thoughtful and intentional, and they should be, but we don't just have to work through traditional political organizations to influence those changes and to build some wider support that then pushes these larger institutions that distribute resources widely and can redistribute them in really important ways. We can influence that with broader community support as well. The more collective organizations we have that support that too.
Excellent points. Thank you so much for reiterating those. There was a message that came in asking how to access the comments in the chat. So if everyone looks in that bottom right-hand corner, there should be a rectangle that says file and then a square with 3 white dots. If you click on that, that first option should be save chat. Wait until the end, because anything that's typed after you save it won't be captured. So right before you leave the meeting, just click save chat. And it will create a document on your computer. Now it's going to be kind of a weird font, but you can just copy and paste it into a Word document and change it to whatever font you're most comfortable with. So great question. There's a lot of valuable information in the chat, so I would encourage everyone to do that. So we have about 10 minutes left. Spoiler alert, the last 2 will be plugs and announcements. Give you a heads up for that. But as we wind down this meeting, what are some things that you didn't know before you joined this meeting? What are some things you kind of had a sense of, but were really solidified either through the video clips or the conversations? And importantly, if you are willing to share, what is something that you are going to do because of that information, because of that new or reiterated knowledge? You can unmute yourself and answer. If you're more comfortable, you can drop it in the chat, either public or private message.
I haven't quite figured out what I'm going to do with this yet, Amy, but I did appreciate, I think it was in the second video, talking about women as caregivers for older relatives. And I think that's something that's often overlooked, and I think that's something that we need to pay attention to, especially as we're talking about people of color who are more affected by COVID. and the recovery time, not just when you're hospitalized, but then who stays at home with them, or do they go to a facility? I know from my personal experience with my mom in a memory care facility, that was honestly $10,000 a month. And if I had to pay for that on my own, I honestly don't know what I would do. And I might consider leaving the workforce if I had to make that decision. So that was something that kind of jumped out. And especially with the pandemic, do you want somebody coming in your home as an assistant? You know, or yeah, there's lots of moving parts with that one. But that was something that I think will become more and more important as we move forward.
And for me, I'll jump in and go next. I am so blessed to be able to work from home, and I'm kind of, you know, it gets a little difficult. I have two not so little ones who are doing distance learner, and one's in the dining room and one's in the kitchen, and I'm upstairs trying to work. But oh my goodness, how fortunate are we? We haven't lost anyone that we know personally to COVID-19, but imagine, you know, not being able to work from home and still dealing with your children doing distance/virtual learning, or being face-to-face and the concerns that come through that. And you've lost one or two or more people to COVID-19. And thank you, Neil, so much for bringing up just that human component of not being able to grieve and to process that with your support community. And then you still might be on top of that, you know, some of the comments that Beth just brought out, caring for older people, and really how much can we bear, and what supports are consistently in place to help us bear those things. And then what does that look like in the immediacy of right now? What does that look like 5 years from now? What does that look like for our children? And how different their experience is. It's just, it is a lot of intersectionality, and it is a lot to process. And not, we're focusing on Black and Latino women. We haven't even talked about, you know, like racism and sexism, and it just add that to the mix as well. It very quickly gets overwhelming. What are some takeaways that you are thinking of as we close?
I want to thank you for offering this. I'm one of those elderly people who's sitting by myself and not feeling very connected, and really very dependent on my daughter, who just took some FMLA time. She was able to do that and take care of me after I had surgery. And this is really hard for me because I'm somebody that always stepped in and helped people. So as an elder, mental health, through where you're coming from, and ageism is in there too. And this time is scary for everyone. And I really appreciate just listening. I was unaware of the numbers of people that are being displaced with their jobs. So thank you very much tonight.
Thank you for joining us. We're really glad to have you here.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll just say thanks to everyone also, and I'll bring some of this into my classes. Definitely, we've been talking about stratification and race and ethnicity this week, so very timely. And I think the local kind of connection with Mayor Welch also is really cool, because I tend to be very university focused and I don't do a lot in the community. And this year I'm actually excited because I usually teach on those Thursdays and can't ever go to those the Racial Justice Conference. But this semester I'm not teaching until 3:30 on Thursday, so I can go. And I'm really looking forward to hearing James Loewen, because I've just been talking about him with Indigenous Peoples Day, speaking of which. So that looks like a great lineup. And to have some follow-up in Milton. I live in Milton, so maybe I'll be able to do some further work there. So great conversation today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. So we have time for a couple more comments. If there are any ahas, anything that blew you away, anything that you definitely were not aware of that now you are, and you can spread the word. Hopefully that'll lead to some action steps and some positive impact in our community. In about 2 minutes, I am going to do announcements and give you a brief preview of our topic for next month, which we're very excited about. So a couple more minutes. If there's something you want to jump in and share, we'd welcome that.
I think one of the takeaways for me, just thinking about what everybody has to say and trying to put that together in my head, because it took me so long to speak because I was feeling overwhelmed with all the information and how difficult it is right now for women, and in particular women of color. And I guess what I would impress upon everyone, to impress upon their circle of influence, is that many of the things that we discussed tonight relate to policies that are decided both at local, state, and federal levels. And I know everybody hates politics. Like, I understand that because it is so divisive, it's so mean-spirited, it can be just so ugly. But what it really does come down to is politics is policy. And we really have to be engaged with who we are electing at all levels of government, because they're the ones that are determining the policies. Other countries are not suffering to the degree that our country is suffering because they've enacted policies where, you know, all of their citizens are getting like $2,000 a month. They're still getting that money. You know, it doesn't, I want to bring people hope because it clearly doesn't have to be this way. We're all going to have impacts, but it didn't have to be this bad. If we had the right people in office that had a global understanding of how far-reaching a pandemic is and genuinely care about everybody and not just themselves or their friends, that they have a level of empathy. So I think that's my biggest takeaway, is I want you to get into the politics of it. Even though everybody's sick of it, I'm sick of it. I'm a nervous wreck till, you know, the election and probably the month after. But we're just going to have to stomach it, and we're going to have to get more involved. And I am hopeful when I see the turnout, and I just hope that people stay engaged.
Mayor Welch, you are going to have the last word on that, because my announcements and reminders begin right now. I'm going to share my screen. Let me move this down. So we are so excited to bring to you virtually this year our 6th annual Racial Justice Conference. Our theme is Be the Bridge to Eliminate Racism, Commit to Action. As was mentioned earlier, our keynote is James Loewen, author of Lies My Teacher Told Me, and What to Do About Them. So I'm so excited that our keynotes for both morning and afternoon are sticking around for breakout sessions. Our afternoon keynote is Dr. Alex Gee, Moving Backwards in a State Whose Motto is Forward, Understanding Wisconsin's Dismal Racial Disparities. So I am looking forward to hearing from both of these gentlemen. We also have a slew of other guests who are going to talk about microaggressions and lots of other very timely topics. We are so grateful for our sponsors who are listed there let me see if I can make this a little bit larger. Not working. So we are so grateful to our sponsors who help us with this every year. So thank you so much for that. And then next month, I will stop sharing. We will be hearing about Indigenous Peoples Day. So of course, Greatest Conversation happens on the 4th Monday of the month, 5:30 to 7. So it's going to be the Monday before Thanksgiving, and what a timely topic. So unless there is something from my fantastic teammates, Neil and Beth, if you have any final words. Neil, is that we're all good sign? Beth?
I just want to remind people about the Diversity Action Team program for November. which is Thursday, November 19th, and it will be led by Allies of Native Nations. So it is also is related to the theme for our next conversation.
Excellent. Beth, is there anything from your end?
Yes, I'm just putting the link to the Courageous Conversations page on the Community Action website. I just put that in the chat. I'll also post it in the Facebook event once we have the YouTube, we have it posted to our YouTube channel. So you can check out previous Courageous Conversations discussions there, and also this one. That'll probably be posted tomorrow.
Perfect segue. It is 7 o'clock and I am ending the recording.